Hello, everyone. This is Jenna Ryan, your self-love life coach. Today's topic for this podcast will be healing your inner critic. Healing your inner critic. We're going to talk today about the foundation of your inner critic and learning to heal your inner critic and live a happier life and have your mind, help your mind to be a more comfortable place to be in because you are more aware of the tapes and the messages that you've incorporated into your everyday thought processes. So this is Jenna Ryan. I'm your self-love life coach. Today's podcast is especially for you, and I'm excited to be here. And I learned a lot of this stuff that I'm going to be talking about today about the inner critic just along my healing journey, along the way. A really good book, if you are really seriously facing issues with your own inner critic, is from Pete Walker, and it's go to his website, Pete Walker. It's called Complex PTSD, From Surviving to Thriving. It's a very, do they call it seminal book? Like it's a foundational book on healing the inner critic. I'm so grateful for Pete Walker's work, and he is someone who's overcome his own trauma and just has a beautiful book there. Highly recommend his website to read every article on the website, which I have done several times years ago, as well as the Complex PTSD book by Pete Walker, which talks about healing the inner critic. And I may be, regurgitating some of the things that I learned from him or just along the way from myself in healing my own inner critic and in my research regarding, developmental psychology and how the ego is created and the superego and the introject of the parent and all of those things. I'm going to be bringing all that in here and talking about it. Now, let me start by saying I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not degreed in this. I'm self-taught. And so a lot of stuff I may not be absolutely perfect on, so you might want to look it up. This is kind of to give you where I've kind of mowed down some land, mowed down some grass. So maybe you can sit and have a picnic and do your own healing and maybe take some of my concepts that I bring up and research it for yourself. I'm not necessarily trying to be exact here. I'm simply trying to bring up things that made sense along my healing journey for me in healing the inner critic for myself, and something that's an ongoing process. And it's really meant for you to just kind of segue for your own journey, take this for your own and learn on your own about these concepts that I'm going to be talking about today with the inner critic. Welcome all of you self-lovies who have been on this journey with me for 10 years or more. And also welcome if you're new to Self-Love You. We talk about self-love here and psychology and healing and, overcoming abusive relationships and recovery. It's just a place where we talk about ourselves and healing. Okay, so in your mind, there are many voices. And we're not talking about psychosis, although there's no shame in mental health. You are where you are, you have what you have, and it is what it is. But the average person has voices. We have tapes. I think everyone the popular culture is pretty much integrated with understanding that we have different voices in our heads. We have different states of being. That's a very popular concept of having, being in your different state, being, in your child state and your adult state. But we also have voices. We have that inner dialogue going on. Some people I've heard do not have an inner dialogue at all, but that would not be me. I have plenty of inner dialogue, and depending upon the environment that you were raised in, you're going to have an inner dialogue. that matches your child development state, what happened in childhood. So if you were berated, criticized, and taught that you're worthless through the actions, through the messaging, through the verbal abuse of others, then you're going to grow up thinking that about yourself and saying that about yourself. Because whenever you are, and if you grow up in a very loving, kind, respectful, considerate, validating environment, you're going to grow up with a validating voice in your head, with voices in your head that are the same. So that's why it's so important when you speak to your children, realize, I heard this in a quote, that when you speak to your children, you are becoming the voice in their head. That's why it's so important to speak so much kindness over children, over your child, and realize that they can pick up on it if you're being fake. And that's why it's so important to stay present for yourself. And that's why it's so important for you to do your own self-work so that you're present, you're truly present, and you're able to give true encouragement, true validation to your children rather than fake, because kids can pick up on it. It's all subconscious. It's all spiritual. It's all beautiful how the human psyche is created. Okay, so back to the voices in your head. So you have these critics, you have these voices. And depending upon your level of insight and your emotional availability to yourself, you're going to be aware of these voices. If you're just now coming upon healing, maybe just now coming upon some of the concepts that I talk about on this channel, you may not be familiar with the voices. So one of the things I recommend in the very beginning is to start writing down the different things that you're telling yourself. Some people might call the voice, you may think it's you. You may think that the voice in your head is you, and you may be very critical of yourself, and you may put yourself down, and you may not realize that voice is not who you are. And so it becomes very important to externalize the negative critic, the inner critic, externalize it and get as far away, be able to view it from as far away as possible, and then begin to shrink it mentally and emotionally. So the inner critic is, if you were raised in an abusive environment or one that was not validating, or an environment that was invalidating, where your feelings were not validated, where you were not loved properly, which means seen, heard, and understood. So if you were not seen, heard, and understood, then you grew up in an invalidating environment. And if you grew up in this environment, you have tapes, messaging, voices, a voice in your head that is constantly invalidating yourself, constantly invalidating you. And it is the parental introject. If you look that up, it's pretty interesting. I kind of went all the way with it. I didn't stop. I went all the way with everything. I went all the way to the end of knowledge when it comes to these things, because I wanted to know what was going on. And so there's a parental introject. So you have a little parent, your parent, good, bad, or indifferent, lives in your head. So this is Freudian. This is, Freud talks a lot about, the parent and things like that, and the id and the super ego. So you have it's my understanding that whenever you have this inner critic, the inner critic is the super ego. So you have the id, the ego, and the super ego. And go look this part up, because I'm not real clear on explaining it. I understand it, but I can't explain it that well. So the super ego is like your introject. And your super ego can go hog wild and go way overboard and make your life miserable. And that's why it becomes important to soothe those aspects of yourself that are overboard. And that's what we're going to talk about here today. So the inner critic is is a part of you that is critical of everything you do. And depending on the level of healing that you've obtained, you may be living in a very, very cruel place mentally. You may be tearing yourself up. You may be ripping yourself to shreds. You may be saying really mean things to yourself. And, that's not your voice. You think it's your voice, but truly, that is not your voice. That is the mistaken beliefs that you've picked up. That is lies that you've picked up about yourself. When you're a little kid and something happens to you, little things, you don't have the reasoning capacity to make a proper assumption. You don't have the resources to be able to go, okay, my mom is in a bad place and she can't afford to feed me lunch, and it doesn't have anything to do with my worth. It has nothing to do with me. It's really just the circumstances, yada, yada. Mentally, a child cannot process all of that. They don't have the life experience. They don't have the brain capacity. They don't have the resources. So a child must just make automatic assumptions, and the child's brain always takes the blame because that's just the simplest, that's the path to least resistance. So the child takes the blame and grows up, and in taking that blame, swallowing that blame, they're swallowing a lie because it's not their fault. The child is innocent and beautiful. But the child swallows the lie and carries that lie on into adulthood forever and ever until they deal with it. So whenever you have, it could be anything, it could be small, it could be large, but there's always a cause and effect. And you're always going to have an effect. And the effect in what I'm talking about is the critic within, constantly telling you, you're not thin enough, your hair's not long enough, you don't look good enough, you don't have enough, you can't do it, you'll never be able to do it. It's just this constant flow of sewage, basically. So there's another reason I think that we have this inner critic, and it is to protect us. Because perhaps we were in an environment where it wasn't safe to be ourselves. And so a voice was formed within to kind of correct ourselves before we made the mistake of being ourselves. So if you had someone who did not like your emotional existence, who didn't like you to cry, who didn't like you to be happy, I was raised in an environment where I was punished for being happy and I was punished for being sad. So I just had to learn how to become a robot. And so in order to do that, to not be punished, I had to really think fast, think on the ball, and go ahead of myself and correct myself before I accidentally would be myself. Okay? So that created that was a coping mechanism for the environment that I was in. Mentally, I had to remind myself not to be myself before, in order to not be punished. So that is a critic arose. Don't do that, because if you do, then you might get punished. And so that's pretty deep. And I don't really share a lot about the depths of what I've gone through, but that was like one of the worst things. And it created such an inner critic. And I don't know if that's combined with the super ego. I haven't really studied it that much. I just know that when you're in an environment where that's basically an invalidating environment, but it's also an environment where not only are you invalidated for feeling, you're basically told not to feel, not to exist, because my feelings made this, person, this adult in my life uncomfortable. All of my feelings. None of my feelings were acceptable and comfortable. Unless it was pain. He liked pain. He liked to see pain. So the only thing that was comfortable was pain. So I was taught that pain is good. That's kind of masochistic. Okay. So that's what I was taught. So you try to live in that environment. And some of you who are listening to me totally get what I'm saying. Okay. So you have this inner critic within that is constantly berating you and telling you. So we also have cultural forces, I think, that are telling us this. So it's this inner critic that is meshed with external messaging. It's important to look good. It's important to look your best. It's important to be healthy. It's important to, have nice, clean hair and things. And all of these things are good for us. But when it becomes a standard by which we measure our worth, and we have this critic constantly in our heads telling us we're not good enough, we can't do it, it basically is like a self-sabotaging mechanism. That's why it's so important to get in there and figure out what you're saying to yourself, what you're telling yourself, and begin to kind of chip away at it. But using CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, which is rationalizing and reasoning with your thought processes. So, if you have a thought that says you could never do that, then coming back with your resourced, wise mind and saying, but maybe I can. Has anybody else ever done that before? Coming from my same shoes, and really having this dialogue between the voices in your head, the inner critic. We're speaking of the inner critic today. So my first recommendation is to get a journal and to write down the things that you were saying to yourself. And when this started for me, it was like a ball of yarn unraveling. It just happened. I was about around 40, and it just started pouring out of me. It was really intense because all the voices, and I started seeing, oh my gosh, that's a voice. That's not me. That's not attached to me. That's not who I am. That's literally inside my head coming against me. It's like I have an army against me due to the trauma that I endured when I was little, and due to the fact that whenever you're dealing with that kind of trauma in childhood, you don't get to grow up. You don't get to develop, because there's certain milestones you have to meet in child development. And if you're so busy trying to avoid punishment and being criticized and whatnot, you don't have time to do the job of growing and learning valuable information that's going to help you become a healthy individual. So you have all these missing milestones. And once you miss those milestones in development, you can't go back until later, like we're doing right now and talking about it. The inner critic. So the inner critic, the superego is there for a reason. You don't want a bunch of people acting amok, like running around, doing crazy things, and not having any shame about it. You don't want, there is some value to having some shame, healthy shame. If you do something wrong, if you act in a way that is not in line with your values, if you're lacking integrity, well, you need something to kind of hold you in line. But do we need this constant inner critic reminding us of our failures, reminding us that we better not try because we might fail, because remember we fell before, and it's this vicious cycle. It's just this repetition compulsion over and over, and you just, self-fulfilling prophecy, you just do whatever it is that your mind is telling you to do. So many people talk about the importance of your words. Really, it's down to the importance of what you're saying to yourself. That's why it's vital that you know what you're saying. Okay? So you write it down, get a journal, get a couple different pens, And for me, it was helpful through the healing journey to write down the sentence. Like I started realizing that I would hear the same things, and I would kind of categorize the different things that I was telling myself about different things I wanted to do. One of the interesting things about me is I've always been able to be successful in life. So I guess I was never harmed in that way, or maybe I was encouraged in that way, in a healthy way or something. I don't know. Or maybe that's the way I overcompensate. I don't know. But I know I can be successful, and I know that I can survive, and I know that I can make it on my own. There's nobody, nowhere, no how that can tell me that I can't. I don't know if that was proper English, but there is no one on this planet who can stop me. I'm going to be successful at whatever I do. And I know for a fact I can get to whatever level I want to be. And I also know that my worth does not depend upon it, because I've actually had to work on that. So I just have this confidence when it comes to money, success, but I don't have confidence all across the board. There's other areas, such as relationships, where I have weakness, where I have the opposite. And so some of you may not have that confidence when it comes to success. You may have, you may feel like you can't. You can't get out of the house. You can't move out of your parents' house. You can't do anything. You may have the opposite from what I have, or you may have both. I mean, you can have, those schemas on all levels. So one of the things I had to do is kind of learn, what am I telling myself whenever I'm about to go achieve something? How am I talking to myself? And how can I transfer that same confidence to that part of myself that's criticizing myself? How can I balance that out? Because if you have the same resources within, they can be used for different reasons. You just have to know how to, tap into it. Integrate those different aspects of your personality. So we're talking about the inner critic. And so you write it all down, and then you argue. One of the things Pete Walker talks about is arguing with the inner critic. I'm telling you, that was so revolutionary, to be able to argue with the inner critic. I remember, to this day, I do this every day. Like if I hear something inside of me that is negative about, just a normal thing I want to do, or putting me down, or if someone on the internet is putting me down and I'm like starting to kind of divert my attention to it, I just immediately I go, screw you. Pete Walker talks about it. So I'm blaming him so I don't sound crazy here, but oh my gosh, when this very first started happening, when I very first learned this concept that you could argue with the inner critic, I was like driving down the road, and I would be like, the inner critic would say something, and I would go, F you. I would go, you don't know what you're talking about, F you. Okay, but I would use the real cuss word at that time. I'd be, screw you. No. And I would like go, nope, not true. I mean, and actually have some backbone against this inner critic. It was cool. It gave me some power. And today I don't have to be as forceful as I did in the beginning, when I would be driving in my car, having an argument with the voice in my head. I don't have to do it as forcefully, but it's a habit now that if something comes up and tries to put me down, I just say, screw off. Nope. What are you talking about? Nope. And then I blow it off. And that's very helpful. So, I don't know, you may have gone through the trauma that I've gone through, or you may not have, or you may have gone through worse. But either way, you may have this inner critic that's telling you you're not good enough, and you've got to stand up to it. Before you stand up to anybody on the outside, you really need to stand up to yourself, to the voice on the inside, so that whenever you do stand up for yourself on the outside, you're able to know it within. You have to know that you know within. And you have to be able to conquer the voices within and make friends with yourself. within. So beginning to reimagine, re-reason with yourself these different critiques that you're constantly giving yourself. First by becoming aware of them and then writing them down and then doing all sorts of things. You can do all sorts of tools to help you. You can write letters. You can learn to associate the critique with the original source. You can begin to, write and connect the dots by saying, okay, I probably learned that I don't look good enough from the family line that was so obsessed with, celebrity and looking perfect. Or I probably thought that I could not succeed in this, and beginning to connect the dots rather than being in the child mode of just taking the blame for everything. You're actually starting to project some of that blame out and put it where it belongs. Instead of projecting the blame inward and taking all the blame and inverting, you're actually pushing it out. In real time, you're literally having to do this with every thought that comes to your mind. And, you don't have to be obsessed with it, although I was. When I first realized this, I was like, oh my gosh, this is groundbreaking for me, because I began to take control of what was being said to me within myself. And I began to take actions that would silence the inner critic. And I began to be the boss of the inner critic, because that parent that put those mean thoughts in my head is no longer in my life. And my mother divorced years ago. And that person is no longer in my life, but they're still in my head. They need to get the hell out. So thank you for, whatever, but no thank you. Don't need you. I'm an adult today, and I can handle this. And inner critic, I'm worthy. And, it's one thing to know it in your head that you're worthy, but to know it in your heart takes healing. And that's the grief process and all that we're talking about here. And some of this may bring up some feelings for you as I'm talking about some pretty deep stuff that really causes a lot of feeling and can cause pain. And so I highly recommend that you connect with someone who can hear you out and get counseling if possible, and make sure you have support through the process to help you to reconfigure your mind. Another thing that helps the inner critic to heal is when you go to therapy and you bring these thoughts into the therapy session, and you have built a bond with your therapist, and you bring these emotional wounds and these lies and this inner critic to your therapist, and your therapist is able to, through that bond that you have, without the bond, it's not as effective. But through the bond, they're able to kind of brace you, and they're able to see you, know you, understand you. And they're able to give room and space for the critic, and they're able to correct the critic. And they're able to implant in you new modes of thought to replace the critique. And I would say without therapy, true healing is not possible. You have to have that. This was done to you by a third party, by somebody outside of you. And so healing has to come in relationship. You were harmed in relationship. If you have a really harsh inner critic, very likely you were harmed in some sort of relationship. I'm not saying it was on purpose. It just is what it is. And so you've got to heal in relationship. And so the therapist becomes the introject in a way. that voice becomes, there's the transference process, and that voice becomes the inner critic, or the new improved version of self-regulation and keeping yourself in line. With a therapist, that kind of will have more of an open, light, airy view, a healthy view of you, a beautiful view of you, if they're a good therapist and they've done their own work and they're healed themselves, then they'll be able to do that for you. Vital. It's so important to have that. It's validating. That's how it's validating. But you don't want a therapist that just sits there and validates the heck out of you all the time, because then you're not learning to validate yourself and you're just becoming more and more dependent. And that is not. So then maybe in the beginning you might need total validation. And then as you move on and develop, then you have to learn to live a little bit without all the validation and all the help, and really rely on your own mind, your own self, to tell yourself you're okay. So healing the inner critic comes from writing it down, arguing with the inner critic, verbally if you have to. Get in a room, just say under your breath, or in the car or whatever. Just have an argument. Say, no, screw you. I'm not listening to you anymore. I'm done. I don't need that anymore. And then journaling to connect the dots, and then also therapy, and then also living that out, and then developing that kind voice, or making room for the kind voice. There, in my opinion, there's a kind voice within us all. It's the voice of God. It's just amazing. And there's a voice within that is already there, and we just have to remove all of the negative words that are covering it up. And be kind, hear that voice that's inside telling us, you're good, you're love, you're loving, you're lovable, you're capable, you're competent, you're confident, you've got this, you can do this. It doesn't always have to be that way. Sometimes things work out. It can work out. It depends upon your attitude. Your attitude equals altitude. You can do this. You've got this. I'm proud of you. There's a voice that's in us that can really help us. And it's totally within, and it's deep, and it's yours, and you got to find it. And it's not anything you really need to struggle to do, just something that there is a path to do this, and it will open up as you seek it. It opens up slowly, and sometimes it opens up a lot, and sometimes it slows down. But either way, you're on a path and you're moving forward to heal yourself within. That is, if you are someone who is in touch and intuitive and fabulous, then this healing is for you. Okay, well, that's what I have to say today about the inner critic. I probably have another podcast or video on this topic somewhere. I have a feeling I've talked about it before. Definitely on my blog, on Self Love You on Blogspot, I definitely have talked about the inner critic a lot. If you need any more resources. Okay, until next time, I'm Jenna Ryan, and I'll talk to you soon.